Well, it looks like it's really game on now. After just 3 weeks in the top job, Prime Minister Julia Gillard is expected to visit the Governor-General tomorrow. So, on what could be the eve of the 2010 federal election, I'm joined now by Christopher Pyne, the Opposition's education spokesman. He's in our Adelaide studio. And with me in Sydney is the Minister for Sustainable Population, Tony Burke. Welcome to both of you.
G'day, Lee.
Good evening, Lee. Good evening, Tony.
G'day, Christopher.
Tony Burke, it must be the worst kept secret in Australia. What time should we switch on the wireless tomorrow to find out what's happening in Yarralumla?
This is a chance for the late line exclusive.
Exactly, and you're the man to deliver it.
Yeah, not delivering that tonight.
Are you aware of what's happening? Has the front bench been briefed?
I'm not. These decisions are announced and made by Julia Gillard and Julia Gillard alone as Prime Minister. So I'm afraid the enthusiasm about getting the date is something that people will have to wait for. What we do know is
wait long, or?
What we do know is what the election will be about. We do know the issues that this election will be fought on, and I think the date becomes secondary to the issues that are at stake in Australia.
Christopher Pyne, what are Tony Abbott's plans for tomorrow?
I don't know where he'll be tomorrow. I'm assuming he's out on the road campaigning and selling his message, and I think the election will be called tomorrow. It surprises me, though, because, of course, when Julia Gillard butchered Kevin Rudd 3 weeks ago, she said that she wanted to get on with governing and had a number of things that she needed to do because the government had lost its way. In the last 3 weeks, in the first week, she tried to do a deal on a mining tax. She claimed it was costing the government $1.5 billion. It actually cost them $7.5 billion. In the second week, she announced an asylum seeker policy, which turned out to be a non-policy because East Timor wasn't playing ball. And this week, she was going to do her economic credentials, and she was blown up by Laurie Oakes yesterday at the National Press Club on welching on a deal with Kevin Rudd. So that's why she's going to an election tomorrow. Labor wants to draw a line under this terrible 3 weeks that Julia Gillard has had, and hopes that by restarting the clock, the Australian public will be tricked into voting Labor at the next election. There are two issues about which this election will be fought. One is cost of living and the pressures on families because of debt and deficit and interest rates and inflation. And the other, of course, is who is best positioned to protect our borders.
OK, there's a lot to follow up on there. Let me first of all put to Tony Burke, has it been a terrible 3 week start for Julia Gillard?
Well, no. Take the first issue that Christopher referred to there on the mining tax, an issue that had been going nowhere for so long, and we ended up with a situation where Julia Gillard switched from consultation to negotiation, and we had an outcome there, an outcome that will still result in cuts to company tax, an outcome that will still result in increases in superannuation. Then Julia did call the opposition's bluff on their claim that they would turn back the boats on refugees. The question had always been, well, what will you do if the boat starts to sink? And now, in the last 24 hours, Tony Abbott finally has started to move away from that and acknowledge that the expectations he was creating were a slogan, not a policy.
Before we go on to discuss the campaign, Tony Burke, let me just ask you to clarify something. Was there some sort of deal between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd about the leadership?
The question that Laurie Oakes asked at the press club goes to what happened during a meeting where Julia Gillard has given her word that she will not reveal what happened during that meeting. It was when you go into a meeting on the basis that this is absolute confidentiality, then you keep your word to that. The challenge that Christopher Pyne's wanting to put forward is to say, well, someone is trustworthy if they break their word. That is a ridiculous concept, but that's exactly what the opposition's arguing.
Let's talk about some of the policies that are going to feature in this campaign. We've already touched on border protection. Christopher Pyne, let me ask you about this. Julia Gillard said today that she thought that there were some points of agreement emerging between Labor and Liberal on the asylum seeker issue. Do you see that?
Well, certainly not, Lee. Before the 2007 election, you might remember, Kevin Rudd said that he would turn back the boats. He, in fact, used the expression, you'd turn them back. And I don't remember Chris Evans or Tony Burke or Julia Gillard before the 2007 election saying that was not possible. We don't have points of agreement with Labor on asylum seekers. We have a policy which, by bringing back temporary protection visas, would take the sugar off the table that people smugglers sell to the unwitting people who pay people smugglers to come to Australia. We have an offshore processing policy which, given Nauru has indicated in recent days, would be quite comfortable with reopening their reprocessing centre. Obviously, our policy could work, whereas Labor has no policy. They had a thought bubble 2 weeks ago, a phone call to the wrong person in East Timor, just highlighting their incompetence yet again. The East Timor solution has completely collapsed. Then they pretended there was a Papua New Guinean solution. That lasted about 24 hours. This government is unfortunately an amateur hour operation, and it's a serious problem because people are suffering as a consequence. People's cost of living is going up. They can't afford groceries. They can't afford the meat and bread and milk to put on the table because of the inflation and because of the cost of living pressures they're facing.
We'll come back to economic issues shortly. I want to stick with border protection for now.
Sure.
Tony Burke, I'll give you a chance to address what Christopher Pyne said there. Was Chris Evans right, though, when he said that the asylum seeker issue was killing the government?
Oh, there's no doubt that people were expecting us to be able to engage with the debate, and people were expecting us to be able to acknowledge what can be done, where there's no quick fix, and also to be looking at what sort of changes and policies you can put in place that will make a difference.
And
the one that Christopher Pyne just talked to, in terms of engaging with the debate, we certainly weren't out there talking about the issue and engaging with the debate the way we are now. That's certainly true. But the other thing is, to carry it forward, Julia Gillard made the important point that there is no quick fix on this. What Christopher just referred to, temporary protection visas, when they were introduced, the number of boats went up, not down. The time where he says the time when he says...
Not true.
Check your statistics, I know them.
Well, I'll tell you in a second. I'll give them to you.
When the boats did start to go down significantly, followed the invasion of Afghanistan. So we need to acknowledge that there are international factors that have an impact here. But for a long-term solution here, you do want to have regional processing, and you want to do it differently to the old Nauru option.
But what about the point that Christopher Pyne raises, that in announcing the stuff about regional processing, that it was badly handled?
The announcement on regional processing was made early when discussions had just begun with other countries. But think if that hadn't happened. Christopher Pyne would have been on your program saying there's a secret deal, they're talking to other countries and they haven't let the Australian people in on the secret. What Julia Gillard did was right at the beginning of those discussions, let the Australian people know that we believe a regional processing solution is the best way to deal with this. And that's different to what Nauru was. Because with Nauru, it was never organised regionally. The only country that would take people was Australia. And what they did was they harboured people in Nauru until after the 2004 election and then put all but 2 of them on a plane to Melbourne.
Let me pick up on something else that Christopher Pyne raised, which is the idea of economic management. Is Labor vulnerable to accusations of incompetence and waste, as Christopher Pyne said, given what we've seen with the BER and the home insulation scheme?
The big test on economic responsibility, which is something that Julia Gillard put forward in the National Press Club when she addressed it, and put a challenge to Tony Abbott to meet the same standard. And that was that election promises made in this campaign will have no impact on the bottom line, that the $3 billion surplus in 3 years' time will be there and will remain intact. In that speech, she put the challenge asking the opposition to meet the same commitment for debt and deficit, to have the situation that our debt is halved, that our debt moves to surplus, that our deficit moves to surplus in 3 years' time, 3 years earlier with a $3 billion surplus. That challenge was put there. To date, Tony Abbott, no response.
How about your track record, though?
Well, we've just gone through a situation where you go across the developing world, we will be, when we're in surplus in 3 years' time, the only developed country, the only developed economy that will be in surplus. Throughout the world, the economic recession, the global recession, has had a massive impact, and yet there will be one nation in 3 years' time that's moved in a surplus. It'll be Australia. That's made a big difference in what's happened with employment outcomes. And don't forget, we talk about employment and unemployment in terms of total numbers. When unemployment figures go through the roof, as they have in many countries, many of those people won't work again. Many of those people will be towards the retirement end. They'll forever be trying to get work. It won't happen again for many of those individuals. The disruption of that is massive, and it has not been part of the story in Australia.
Christopher Pyne, you're